And one thing you mentioned in passing is the whole business of the idea of sort of hotels in space, space tourism, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder, is this really realistic? Just thinking about the relative risk, going to space, you may be a sort of 1 in 100 chance you're going to die. You're going on a plane, perhaps 1 in 10 million. It's rather different, and it's not going to come together very soon.
Well, Brian, would you go?
No, no way.
Well, I think I'd go, but then when it actually came to it, because, as you know, what you're doing is you're climbing up to the top of a massive, massive petrol tank stroke bomb, and then someone sets fire to it. That is space travel. So when it came to it, I don't know. I think I would go. I would like to go. William Shatner, Star Trek's Captain Kirk, went.
Sort of. Just about.
Musk and Bezos argue about that, and many other things. Well, look, Richard Branson, I mean, I know that side of things, one side of his space enterprises has gone belly up, but the tourism side is still going on with. And so is Bezos. And how many people do you need? When you're thinking that it's going to cost $250,000 per person or whatever it is, you don't need that many, and I think there are that many. So I think space tour, I don't really go into it much because it is a sideshow. But I found one of the things in the research, it was only 30 years after Kitty Hawk took off, the very first flight, before more Americans were traveling by plane than were traveling by train. So when Kitty Hawk first took off, you and I might have had the same conversation. Would you go in one of those? Maybe not. So I think we might see something similar if it becomes normal. Because I still think going up in a plane is pretty crazy, even though I know the stats that you mentioned. So I think space tourism could be a thing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose one thing that always occurs to me, I used to work at British Airways, and we tend to assume technological advances means we'll always go faster and further.
Yeah.
When I worked at BA, we were operating Concorde, and you go twice the speed of sound. No, you can't. It was backwards.
That was really interesting, wasn't it? It was an interesting psychological thing when Concorde was grounded. I actually covered, as a journalist, I covered the Concorde crash in Paris. Sorry, that's not really relevant. Yeah, that was a psychological blow because, we always go further and faster. Oh, hang on a minute. No, we don't. But after that hiatus, which is what, 20 years now, probably.
At least.
Well, we haven't got hypersonic planes. We've got hypersonic missiles coming at Mach 5. So the technology actually of man-made machines, human-made machines, I should say, are going faster and faster. So you're right, transport, and people are working on the hyperloops and things like that, which, I know. No, I think that it holds. I think we will go faster and further, but we have had a massive hiatus in getting rid of Concorde and the idea of supersonic flight.
Right, yeah. One thing with airlines, there's an awful lot of law behind it, a lot of legal structures internationally. So perhaps moving into the astropolitics side of it, there are treaties out there, but I get the impression that they're frankly not up to much.
Well, look, you through your own work, you've looked into this, and I'm glad you agree with me, because I'm expecting a little bit of pushback, because I argue quite strongly that the treaties that we have are not fit for purpose for the 21st century. I think as a framework and as a concept, they're great. And the Outer Space Treaty 1967 does talk about space being for the common good of humanity. No one could own it. But I think that whilst that might be a framework, when you go into the detail, for example, no weapons of mass destruction, fine, but it says nothing about lasers. And as you know, we now have direct energy weapons that can take down a drone from almost a mile up. and it costs, a few dollars worth of electricity to bring it down instead of shooting a $250,000 missile at it.
Yeah.
So it's obvious which direction that's going to go. And now that that technology exists, like I said, I think it's inevitable they'll put them on the satellites. So there's nothing in the treaty. So either redraft it or start again, preferably start again. There's not enough in it about commerce, about commercial enterprise, because it wasn't a thing then. Talk about the Moon Treaty, hardly anybody ratified it, so it's not worth a candle. Talking about space situational awareness, SSA, we don't have a globally agreed framework for everybody reporting in every single bit of debris that they know about, and us all tracking it together, every single bit about satellites. We don't have laws about how close one satellite can be to another. And if my satellite is part of my nuclear early warning system, and the great powers it is, I'm going to get very nervous if your satellite comes up behind mine, especially if it's got those grappling arms, which some of them have now, or nets. So, we need these agreements, and I think we need them urgently.
But is that realistically going to happen urgently?
Oh, you're a hard man, Brian. I'm going to probably say no. Eventually, yeah. Nuclear weapons forced us to have nuclear agreements, non-proliferation treaties, trust but verify, checks and balances, tests. It didn't happen immediately. It happened once we realized the enormity of the threat. I think in the space world, they do realize the enormity of the threat. I don't think that's true of the political world. And I think it's even less true of the general public for, a whole bunch of reasons. We haven't really discussed this. So we will go through the initial phase of, there is already an arms race, but which perhaps we could come to. So once we've gone through the initial phases of the arms race and the initial phases of the competition to get places, and actually I must hopefully have time to talk about the Artemis Accords, and there's a particular clause in them that's very problematic. Then, yeah, we will settle down and say, okay, look, we need rules of the road. We need off-ramps in case things are tense. We need clarity. We need frameworks. It'll come, but not for a few years yet.
Okay, since you brought up the Artemis Accords.
Thank you.
Well, it might be worth saying what they are.
Yeah. Well, again, this is part of the framework of the book that I am arguing strongly, or pretty obvious, that the tensions here are mirrored there. So you have the Chinese with Russia as a junior partner on Earth, and that is mirrored in their relationship in space. Russia is easily the junior partner now. And just as opposing them in the non-autocratic world, you have the American-led bloc. So it is in space, where I think there's about 23 countries have signed the Artemis Accords. Now, these are a series of bilateral agreements. So America has drafted them and then signed bilaterals with about 21 other countries, including the UK, Nigeria, France, UAE, I think. But when you sign up to them, you're signing up to the American view of what the rules of the road should be. And there's 193 countries in the world, but there's only about 23-ish who've signed up for that. But does that become the norm? And the reason I remembered to mention them is that I think it's either Article 9 or 11, talks about when you've invested so much, billions, in getting there, developing the mining equipment, and beginning to mine and finding where the resources are. We know that most of it at the South Pole region, because that's where the water ice is. There's this article that says you can declare a safety zone, and you can declare how big your safety zone is. You can even declare the duration that your safety zone will exist. But the scenario is obvious. Another country, a non-Artemis country, lands very close to you and starts digging, and you say, excuse me, the Artemis Accords, and they say, nothing to do with me, Gov. So it's all very well having your Article 9 or 11. It's another thing expecting other people to agree with it. So it's another argument about why we need to, have a universally or perhaps globally agreed frameworks.
Okay. And as well as just these accords, presumably, you know, if you consider some, particularly Mars, say, as a totally separate planet, does it have to have its own entire legal framework, you know, from scratch?
Well, before we get there, Canada last year changed its laws. You probably know on the space station, International Space Station, if in the Japanese module, the Japanese technicians invent something, it is considered legally as if it was invented in Japan. Mm-hmm. If, unfortunately, a Japanese astronaut was to kill another Japanese astronaut in the Japanese module, Japanese law applies. And for all the other countries. Canada has actually extended that to the surface of the moon. A Canadian citizen on the moon, because they are part of Artemis and they are in the frame for maybe 28, 29 to have an astronaut walking on the moon. Mm. Canadian law will apply to Canadian citizens on the moon, which I think is interesting. I think they're the only ones that have done this. So if you move all the way up to Mars, well, yeah, you can have the same thing, but as you know from probably a million sci-fi tales, there's no way in hell at a certain point the population of Mars is going to take any notice of what Earth says. And the analogy for me is 1776, the 13 colonies were saying, King Who, you don't tell us what to do over here. You're 3,000 miles away. We're going to have an American Revolution. And Musk has already written into his terms and conditions of Starlink internet system, if you sign up for it now, you're actually signing up that he's in charge on Mars, which again is quite amusing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as you suggested, there's been a lot of science fiction background to this type of thing. There's this famous Robert Heinlein book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where they...
Could you, I'm going to write that down, Brian, because I've been looking for... oh, here it is. I've been looking for a novel on this. What's it called?
The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Oh, thank you.
Where the lunar colony basically becomes dependent because they can throw rocks at the Earth. So they're set up to be miners.
I think there's a series on one of the subscription channels at the moment on a similar line. So no, thank you. I should be getting that. Thank you.
Right. So if we've got new laws, at least hopefully preventing us from annihilation in space. So I suspect the military side, if you like, is liable to come first. Do we end up to start with the kind of Wild West, you know, in terms of commercial operations? So mining, say, if it is a private operation that's, say, going out to mine an asteroid, somebody else says, "Ooh, I'll have a bit of that."
Yeah,
that's liable to happen.
I think so. I don't see what the laws are that says you can't. The Americans might argue that, you know, their American law counts on the moon and therefore this is their area. Not sovereign, of course, because nobody would dare say that. But, you know, that's just a word. The reality is we're in this area. US commercial law will apply, you know, and you can it'll keep the space lawyers in work for years. So there are the commercial side of it. It is the Wild West. It's the Klondike gold rush, and I don't think that's a good thing. Again, the leading powers that are going to be there, whether it's UAE, Israel, Italy is a bit of a player, Japan is absolutely a player, Russia, China, the USA. They do need to sit down and agree that, you know, whoever is there in that part first, we will agree there are certain boundaries. You have staked your claim not to the territory, but for the mining rights. You know, and it is going to be a legal issue. Okay, you can have mining rights there for 10 years or whatever. This area here, and it's going to be divvied up. And if you don't have the laws, it could get messy. And, you know, we are, of course, dealing with an extremely hostile environment. And it's not an exact parallel, hardly, but recently in the Sudan evacuation, the Brits flew a plane in onto the apron to try and get some people out, but they in the confusion, they hadn't told the Germans, and the Germans had a plane and they nearly hit it, which is exactly why you need clarity. and it's an even more hostile environment up on the moon. So, you know, you need clarity of who's going to be operating where, with what, on what communication systems, what signals are going out, what blinding flashing lights, etc. When, you know, it sounds a bit sci-fi, and we're not quite there yet, but I think we could be there within 10 years.
Right.
No, that's optimistic. You know, well, you know the timeline. It's 2026 to walk on the moon again. More people walking on the moon every year after that, putting in the basics for a base, and then they want to start building a base early 2030s. Once that's up and running, then you know, you're not building it for no reason. In comes the potential to mine.